Hey there, I'm Alex Kidman and this is the Xiaomi Poco F6 Pro, a phone about which I have very mixed feelings. Let's get into the review. So look, for the longest time, if you wanted a Xiaomi phone here in Australia, well, you could get one. People were grey market importing them in certain numbers, really impossible to say how many. But then you're dealing with international warranty support and potentially oddness with band support and things like that. There hasn't been an official way to get Xiaomi phones for a while. Now, that changed late last year when a local company, Xiaomi Tech, picked up the rights to Xiaomi in Australia. They released some of the Redmi phones and, more recently, the Poco phones. So we got the Poco F6 and the Poco F6 Pro. So these are mid-range to high mid-range phones. This is a $999 phone, and it's one that I think has some really interesting standout features and some really puzzling omissions and choices too. Now, ordinarily, I'd get straight into the review talking about the design, but I do have to point out this is a phone that you can get online through other sources, sometimes for several $100s less than the local retail price. Now, Xiaomi Tech's position on this is that the local models have features like NFC and full 5G band support, and of course that you're getting a local warranty, and that's not nothing. That's not worth nothing. Whether that's worth it to you specifically is a different matter. But the reason I'm pointing that out is because I am judging this and assessing this as the Australian model at the Australian price. So I'm comparing to $999 phones because that's what the Australian model would cost you, officially speaking. Yes, you can get one cheaper. The point there being that the comparisons I'm making are to other $999 or thereabouts priced phones. I just want to make that clear before I start in, before someone says, oh, but this is very mid-range in my market and I can get a similar phone much cheaper. Yeah, I know. But I have to compare like with like here, and in this case, that's $999 like. So the Poco F6 Pro is built around a 6.6-inch 120Hz capable AMOLED screen with a resolution of 3200 by 1440. Nice and sharp and also very bright, up to 1200 nits in high brightness mode and up to 4000 nits in peak brightness, although peak brightness figures are often grain of salt figures, shall we say. Numerical claims aside, visibility is actually very good even in direct sunlight. There's a nice panel to look at. In Australia, the Poco F6 Pro sells in either black or white finishes. It's the white that Xiaomi Tech has sent me. And it's a really nice visual design. I really like the look of it, although it is very, 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 very slippery. Like I'm playing around with it here, but honestly, I have dropped this phone and I'm really careful with phones. And I think most of you know what's coming now. I'm going to tell you to put a case on it. And yeah, you should. And there's one in the box, but there's a problem. It's even a problem for me, and I love putting cases on phones, as I think most people know. And the problem is that the case is really, really ugly. Like, this is just kind of, well, proving to be hard to get on, because it's just a rubber case, but this is just kind of grim. I really don't like it. I really, really don't like it, in fact. Now, the good news is, because Xiaomi is a big brand in China, there are loads of third-party cases. I don't get why they didn't put a clear case in here, actually. It did preserve the look of the phone and help preserve the phone itself. Now, in terms of durability, by the way, Xiaomi Tech in Australia do not make any specific claims about IP-rated water resistance. Looking around internationally, it appears that it might be IP54, but it's really not terribly clear. Basically, you should probably try to avoid getting this phone wet. And here again, I've got to bring that localized $999 price point into play, because at that price, absolutely, you can get IP67, sometimes IP68 rated phones. So even if this is IP54, it's a little bit below the grade for its price point. In terms of controls, you're talking a standard classic power button and volume buttons on the side. There's a very fast fingerprint reader built into the display, and then a dual nano SIM card tray at the base. Now, one important omission here, one thing that you do see a lot of in $999 phones here in Australia at this price, is eSIM, but there's no eSIM support on this phone, just dual nano, and there's no micro SD card expansion either. So what about the camera? Because again, at this kind of price point, you're just starting to punch up into that premium flagship space, and so you should expect some pretty darn good cameras, right? Well, here again, it's really mixed. At a technical level, around the back you find a 50 megapixel wide lens, 8 megapixel ultra wide lens, and 2 megapixel macro lens, and honestly, that can't help but feel to me like a camera recipe from like a mid-2022-ish phone, especially with that 2 megapixel macro, because they just used to be everywhere in those phones and none of them were terribly good. At the front, you've got a 16 megapixel selfie taker. And yeah, it's just a really interesting, odd little mix. Not quite as premium feeling as that price point might suggest, if I'm honest. But of course, smartphone photography is more than just a game of counting the megapixels up and coming to a conclusion that way. It's about what it can produce, and what it can produce, again, interesting and mixed. So, for example, there's no telephoto on board, and I really would have omitted that 2 megapixel macro and put a telephoto in here. If I was Xiaomi, it would make for a much better phone, but it's not there, so you've just got digital cropping, standard at 2 times within the supplied camera app, and then up to 10 times, but it's not great. I mean, it's certainly not graded up to 10 times. So, for example, here's a shot of the clock at the centre of Sydney's Queen Victoria building, just taken with the ultra-wide lens. That's all fine, of course, as is the standard wide shot. And the 2 times zoom, yeah, that's all right too. The 10 times, however, yeah, it's really, really not. And again, at this price point, yeah, telephoto can be a thing if that's what you want. Now, I did say it was interesting and mixed, though, so one area where this can do okay is in low-light photography. And again, you'd sort of expect that at this price point. But it's doing it with a lot of AI, with a lot of interpretation, with long exposures, the usual tricks that most smartphones in this price range carry with them. And the results, while interesting, are not always true to life. And I'll give you an example here. So while I was out doing some low-light testing of the new Apple iPhone 16 Pro Max, very different phone, very different price range, and I'm not doing this as a head-to-head shootout with the Poco. That would not be fair to the Poco. I also took some shots with it. And this is its low-light pickup when it's very, very dark. Now, it's kind of impressive that it can get this much light at this price, yes. But there's a lot of color estimation here. There's some washed out color, and there's some stuff that's just not accurate to the color of the grass, the time of day that it was. This is a very kind of common trick that a lot of these phones do, and you can get some good results, but as I say, you can also end up with some stuff that just looks way too artificial. It's doing stuff, actually, that Google's Pixel phones used to do an awful lot of. And I always used to describe that as kind of crayon coloring in effect, and it's very much in play here. Now, that doesn't always lead to terrible photos, though. So, counterexample, I suppose, here's a shot taken at Sydney's Town Hall Station just of the train tunnel. Mostly dark, and it gets quite a lot of detail there, but with a bit of a colour cast again. Some of the colours are a little bit off, but it's interesting to see. And you can get some decent low-light photos. Not as good as you might with some phones, but certainly way better than you can with others. There's some other oddities in play here too. So, for example, I wasn't expecting much out of the 2 megapixel macro sensor, but first I had to find how to actually use the 2 megapixel macro sensor, because you'd think, all right, cool, camera app, it's got a macro lens, it'll have macro as one of the photo options in its little photo menu in the UI. No, it's not there. It's not there at all. It's on this pull-down menu instead, and I'm sorry, Xiaomi, I don't understand why you did that. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. It's just confusing. It's extra taps if I want to take a macro shot. I don't like it. And realistically, it's 2 megapixel macro sensor. The results are not anything to really write home about either. You can do much better than this. And yeah, weird choice there. But look, otherwise, photos out of this and video are all right. It does okay, but you could certainly do better. I mean, for this kind of money, I'd probably look to something like Pixel 8a if you wanted some really nice and accurate photos. And that's still using a whole lot of AI in place, of course. I think most of the people who are going to shoot with the Poco F6 Pro are not going to be super disappointed. In some ways, I am a fussy critic, and I admit that. But I think at the same time, especially at the $999 price point, yeah, it probably could have done a little more here. On the performance front, the Poco F6 Pro is built around a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor, aka last year's flagship processor of choice for flagship phones. For the Australian model, we're talking 12 gig of RAM and 256 gig of storage with no capability for microSD expansion. But internationally, there are also 12 gig RAM 512 gig models and 16 gig RAM 1 terabyte variants of the Poco F6 Pro. We're not seeing those ones here at all. Now, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 is a very solid choice for a processor, especially at this price point, and that absolutely shows when I benchmark it. So, for example, here's how it compared against similarly priced phones using Geekbench 6's CPU test. That's a really pleasing result for the Poco F6 Pro. It does well there. And it's much the same story in GPU terms, where the Poco F6 Pro has a definite power advantage. And that's because it's basically last year's flagship at a less than flagship price. Not bad at all. And it does play out in app usage. This thing is fast and responsive. And if you do want to throw those heavier duty apps, and especially heavier duty Android games at it, yeah, it'll manage them basically without breaking a sweat. It does well and it runs well in terms of those high-end apps. The model supplied to me was running Android 14, and Xiaomi Tech promises 2 Android OS updates and 3 years of security updates. Now, obviously, that is not keeping pace with the likes of Google and Samsung, where for this kind of money you can get 7 years. That's a pretty big gap there. But there's another wrinkle in here, and it is one that definitively I'm not a huge fan of. Because this is far from a stock Android phone. Xiaomi applies its own HyperOS launcher on top of Android 14, and there's a lot to get used to here. Now, I know why this is the case. This is the case because this is a phone primarily built for the Chinese domestic market, where Android is a thing, yes, but Google isn't. You can't put Google Play services onto a Chinese phone. It's not permitted by the Chinese government. I'm not going to get into the geopolitics of that one. It's just the way it is. Therefore, you get all of these Chinese OEMs who make their own launchers on top and have their own app stores and their own approaches to how all of this is done. And that's what we see here. But this has to compete with phones that have Google Play. This does have Google Play, just to be transparent about it. You can access Google Play in the normal way. But it also has Xiaomi's own app store on there, and it's kind of pushy in a couple of ways. For a start, it installs a whole bunch of apps by default. And I'm sort of used to that by now for a lot of phones. So a lot of phones, for example, you'll suddenly find that you have, for example, LinkedIn and especially the Booking.com app pre-installed. And yeah, Booking.com is right here. But typically with most phones, it's like maybe 3 to 6 apps that get bundled in. The Poco F6 Pro has more than 20 of them. It's a lot of apps dumped onto your device, which you may not want at all. In fact, you probably don't. So, for example, there's an app called Me Video, and it's basically a TikTok clone. But it's a TikTok clone that collects your data as it goes, and unless you actively opt out of telling it to collect your data, it's just going to do that. And frankly, I mean, if you want your data harvested, why not just go for actual TikTok? Then there's a whole range of pretty low-rent looking Android games on here, which I definitively did not want to install, and they're all here, and they're all taking up space and clutter, and it's just like, ugh! Gets to my brain. So too does HyperOS. HyperOS just rewrites Android. And look, I'm on the record as saying I am very much a stock Android kind of guy. I like configuring it my way, not your way. And while it's not impossible to get used to what HyperOS does, you will have to look around a little bit further and deeper to see where things are within the UI. There's a little bit more work and familiarization involved. That won't suit everyone, I'll put it that way. So on the battery front, the Poco F6 Pro has a 5,000 mAh battery, which is kind of surprising actually because it's a fairly heavy phone. I kind of thought it might have had a bigger battery than that actually. But no, 5,000 mAh, which is very standard for Android to be fair. And I was keen to see how well it would handle, given it's got a higher run processor, it's got a better screen. These things do take up a fair bit of power. So first of all, I ran it through my standard YouTube battery test. Now that's 1 hour of 1080p video playback, maximum brightness, and moderate volume from a full battery to see where it gets to. And that's a dual purpose test. If it drops below 90%, then most people will probably find it'll struggle to last a day. But also I want to see how it compares against other phones. And of course, every percentage point above 90% is good, is better, because it can mean hours and hours of extra battery usage. And here, the Poco F6 Pro did really well. Here's how it compares. Absolutely nothing to complain about there, for sure. And then there's the charger situation. So, at a technical level, the Poco F6 Pro can support up to 120 watt charging. Very, very fast. I should point out, there's no wireless charging. It's completely omitted from this model. Again, that's a little bit odd at this price point specifically. But, like I said, 120 watt fast charging. But not so much for the Australian model, or not really for the Australian model, I should say, because the Australian model does not come with a charger in the box. Now, the unit that Xiaomi Tech supplied to me was clearly an imported one, because in fact it did come with the 120 watt charger. Here it is, a big old block of a thing. And this isn't available in Australia. What Xiaomi Tech are selling is a 67 watt dual charger. They also sent that one to me for review, but that'll cost you an additional $50. And I got curious. Does the 120 watt charger work if you plug it into a plug adapter? Well, I mean, it becomes a big monster of a thing, obviously, huge, but yeah, it charges, it picks it up as charging at 120 watts. It will work. I'm not exactly sure, because this is rated for 100 to 240 volt charging here in Australia, but I'm not a Sparky. Maybe it doesn't meet some other electrical safety standard here, so I didn't charge for long. I charged to check that it would work, and I was ready to pull a trip switch to stop my house burning down if it didn't, but clearly it didn't. But there's a bigger problem here, of course, which is international models may come with some level of charger. We're not getting one at all. You're going to have to pay extra to access the fast charging that this can do. And I think that's a bit of a pity. I'm not exactly sure why they couldn't have either at least bundled this charger in with the unit. They are doing a bit of a pre-order special early on where you get a store voucher with them, and one of the few things you could spend it on, in fact, would be this charger. That's not so bad, but you're not going to see that after a fairly short period of time, actually, after this review goes live. So, yeah, a bit of a missed opportunity there, I feel. But look, overall on the battery front, battery life is great. I mean, that's not just theoretical tested stuff. Day to day, it's been fine for me, and it will charge fast from other chargers as well. So should you buy the Poco F6 Pro? Well, look, honestly, it's been a long while since I've been this conflicted about a smartphone. On the one hand, the performance here is genuinely superb for the money, beating everything out in its class, fairly effortlessly. The battery life is really, really good. The charging can be very, very fast, and the display is really, really nice. These are all big pluses. However, their cameras aren't quite where I'd want them to be at the Australian asking price. There's no eSIM, and the HyperOS overlay and pre-installed apps are a bit of a nightmare to deal with. Charging can be very fast, and it probably will be for models not purchased in Australia, but if you want that, you'll have to pay extra for a charger that's not quite as fast as the phone can handle, and that's even after asking more for the phone in the first place, which just doesn't sit that well with me. So like I said, I'm genuinely conflicted about this one. There's a lot to like here, and there's a lot not to like, and it leaves it as a kind of tough phone for me to absolutely recommend. I feel like I should love this phone a whole lot, but I just don't. Anyway, that's my take on the Poco F6 Pro. Got any thoughts on it? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Thank you.